Good afternoon, everyone. Just like to introduce myself. My name is Niall Brennan. I'm the Global Head of Engagement for the security organization at SAP. And on behalf of SAP and the Tech Accord, I'd like to welcome you all here. This is our second year hosting this event. We were proud to host the 5th anniversary celebration last year, and that was also the grand opening of this office space, which at the time we were very keen to show off. So we're doing that again, and I thank you all for being here. Just a couple of quick things. If you're looking for bathrooms, they're right around basically the other side of this wall. And if you could just stay on this floor, there's a little bit of a barrier on those steps. Other thing, I'd just like to do some quick thank yous to some unsung heroes in the room or in the building. SAP's own Kathleen Murphy is instrumental in kind of arranging and setting up this event from a facilities point of view. And I would also like to thank Brett Sylvia, who is providing our tech support. So if anything goes wrong, don't throw anything at poor Brett. With that, I'll turn it over to John to run the rest of the program. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Niall, and thanks so much to SAP for hosting us yet again for the 6th anniversary now of the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. Thanks so much to folks in the room who've been part of our industry coalition for some of you many months, some of you many years at this point, a group which has worked for a long time now to try and be the industry's voice on peace and security online. In sort of a world of rising geopolitical tensions and escalating conflict online, this is really meant to be the corresponding industry coalition to provide good guidance and sage input to the increasingly important field of cyber diplomacy. I'd also like to welcome those who are online as well, and really appreciate the virtual attendance and those who could be here with us in person at RSA. If you want to go to the next slide here, Max. So the anniversary event every year also debuts our anniversary report. This is part of our coalition's commitment to periodically, and in this case annually, update on the progress of our coalition. We're a group of what started as 34 and is now 160 some odd companies committed to foundational principles to support peace and security online. And that is strong defense, improving the security of our company's products and services, no offense, not supporting the weaponization of cyberspace or offensive cyber operations, capacity building, working to support, raise the overall level of cyber resilience and cybersecurity around the world, and then doing more together as a coalition. And that's something that's outlined hopefully throughout the report that are on a few chairs around you now. So please take a hard copy. Or if you're joining us online, if you go to cybertechaccord.org, we did release the live report again today. I won't go through all the particulars here, but it does outline a robust bunch of work that's taken place over the past year, really thanks to a lot of volunteer time, commitments, passions, and priorities from folks from across the digital ecosystem and across the globe. I want to go to next. And one hallmark every year now of our annual report is an update of the annual state of international cybersecurity thermometer. It's sort of our version of the doomsday clock that the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientist puts out, although a little less alarmist. We did launch this last year with a metaphorical boiling point of 100 degrees. That was the year that had just seen Russia had its full invasion of Ukraine and the widespread use of cyber operations in that armed conflict, which raised a lot of concerns about things escalating very rapidly out of control. As you'll see this year, there's actually been an incredible amount of positive activity as it relates to diplomatic and institutional developments. A lot of cause for hope and optimism moving forward, yet the overwhelming elephant in the room is the continued increase in the number and scale and sophistication of nation-state cyber attacks online, escalating geopolitical tensions that have seen the continued use of cyber operations in armed conflict and the threat for further use of cyber operations in armed conflict. So on balance, we've ticked that measurement up just slightly to 101 degrees this year in the hopes that by next year, things will have started to de-escalate and hopefully greater stability in cyberspace overall. we hope they'll take some chance to flip through the report. Those who are here from industry and are not part of our coalition, consider joining. We'd love to have more members from across the technology industry supporting those shared values for peace and security online. If you're from academia or civil society, partner with us on something. We love having friends and folks who are joined in our various efforts across the year. And with that, I'd like to focus the discussion this evening on the ongoing UN cybercrime treaty negotiations, which has been perhaps the biggest priority for our coalition over the past year, led by our lead negotiator, Nick Ashton-Hart. So over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, John. Great to see you all here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Cybercrime Convention negotiations. A handful. Yeah. Okay, good. So for those of you who aren't, I'll briefly give you the brief story. Basically, Russia proposed that the world have a global cybersecurity convention, mostly because they didn't want to join the existing Budapest Convention that was adopted by the Council of Europe in 2001, but now has 68 signatories from all over the world, not just European states. And so it managed to persuade the General Assembly by 10 votes before it invaded Ukraine to have a treaty negotiation on crime that was not based on a consensus. All other crime conventions are negotiated in Vienna, and they're done by consensus because, of course, this ensures that you can have as many parties to it as possible, and it can be as widely adopted as possible. But Russia was not looking for that. It was looking for speed. And as it was overheard to say to the Belarusian delegate at the last meeting, wasn't really interested in cybercrime cooperation. It was interested in getting the data of individuals from third states. So no one is surprised by this. Russia is not famous for cooperating on criminal matters with other countries. In fact, it's famous for ignoring requests for cooperation. So no one was really expecting that it was about that in the first place. The idea was a widely adopted cybercrime convention. Unfortunately, we're in the final stages of the negotiation now. There's one more 2-week meeting beginning in July. And the state of this now, you're going to hear much more about it from the other speakers. But to give you an idea of how badly wrong this has gone, it's currently facilitating cooperation on any crime that any two states want to cooperate on, which is quote unquote serious, and which has technology is in any way connected to it, which could be as simple as using a modern mobile phone to make a phone call, which is a rather analog undertaking normally. And the member states agreed at the last session to effectively make witness protection optional by taking out any minimum protection for witnesses. So this is how far wrong that this has gone. And the risks to civil society are profound, as you will hear from Katitza. The issues for companies are very serious, with the ability of states to keep all their cooperation secret in perpetuity and do things like seize traveling tech workers and force them to divulge access to secure systems in order to get data from them. So I will let, all of that sounds rather terrible, and it is. It is rather terrible. And I will leave it to Chris Painter and our panelists to give you more details.
All right, I'm Chris Painter. I'm the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise Foundation. It's a global cyber capacity building platform with about 200 members and partners, 220 members and partners, many states, civil society, industry groups, including Microsoft and others. Welcome anyone who's not a member of that also to join that, any institution, any civil society or any company. So we have a great panel here. You see them on the screen. Amy Hogan-Burney, who is the General Manager for Cybersecurity Policy and Protection at Microsoft. Amy, if you can take your seat. Eric Wenger, Senior Director for Cyber and Emerging Tech Policy at Cisco. We used to work together with Justice many years ago. Katitza, it's always nicer to see you work together, right? Katitza Rodriguez, who's the policy director for global privacy at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Oh, there she is. Okay. And finally, Jake Williams, who's a security researcher. Okay, great. So, we're going to have a panel discussion. We're also having a discussion with the audience as Nick kind of framed it. Either this is going toward a conclusion in July or it's careening out of control, depending on what perspective you have. I was involved in some of the negotiations around the Budapest Convention many years ago. I think one of the challenges with this convention is that unlike the Budapest Convention, there's not what we call explanatory text. There's not things that the nuance often gets lost when you have text that doesn't have any kind of explanation. And United Nations treaties just don't do that. And so that's one issue. There's also, I think, a need. A lot of countries look at this and they say, we really need this. Yes, many have joined Budapest. And really an interesting development is the whole fact of this treaty negotiation, according to the Council of Europe people, have driven more countries to join Budapest than ever before. So it's had that positive effect. But they really feel they need something in the UN. They want something from it for evidence exchange for a whole host of reasons. So there's a sense that a lot of people have been negotiating in good faith to try to make that happen. But as Nick mentioned, the dynamic, a lot of these issues get very complicated very fast. It's hard to reach any kind of consensus or get any kind of result from these things. There is a dynamic, frankly, where some, we call like-minded states, the U.S. and others, do push for certain protections, like we're talking about researchers, and they get some hook in there. But the worry is if you push too much, then other countries will yank it out entirely. So there is this weird negotiating dynamic that happens, I guess, in any treaty, but certainly happens here. And we'll see what happens. I mean, really, I don't know what the betting odds are on them actually reaching a conclusion on this in July. I think fairly 50-50 or so. But I'm going to turn to our expert panelists. There's lots of things written. Nick referred to some of them in letters by civil society. They think are worth, if you're not familiar with them, checking out. I do a podcast called Inside Cyber Diplomacy. We just had the U.S. Ambassador Deborah McCarthy on to give her, her reflections on it, so you can listen to that. But we have live here a number of experts who have different perspectives on this, and I think I really want to hear from you guys on some of the issues. And Amy, let me start with you. Microsoft obviously has been a strong voice really throughout the negotiations. You've been there at every meeting that I've seen, at least, and you've been there, and really following it, really devoting resources to it, and also intervening robustly. You haven't just sat there quietly. And the one good thing about these negotiations, unlike some other UN meetings that I've often been going to, like the open-ended working group, there is a process for stakeholders to be there. Some people say it's a gold process. It's really more like the bronze process, basically. But at least other stakeholders, companies, and others can take the floor, can have some impact, can work the room to some extent, and certainly Microsoft, among others, have done that. But one of the issues is I think one of the things I've heard Microsoft frequently intervene on is the importance of transparency, the rights of users to be notified when their data is being used in governments. I know that's been a longstanding Microsoft policy. When you're dealing with some states, there are more developed states and have more of a robust legal system. There are protections in place, but the worry is they're not here. So the current text doesn't call for any disclosure by states when they use the powers in the convention. So what do you think the impact is that? What is a concern that you see in that?
Well, first,
and can it be mitigated, I guess?
Yeah. And I think first I wanted to, Nick, you mentioned that the Russians actually said that it was a surveillance treaty. And I don't know that I'd heard that story before, but I will tell you that several years ago, when we first at Microsoft started thinking about how we would engage, we got together a group across the company. And at the time, I led just the digital crimes unit. So I was not involved in digital diplomacy. And frankly, to be honest, I was like, why are you calling me about a UN treaty that's being advanced by Russia? I don't, this is not something that I need to deal with. We also had our lawful access team there, our telecommunications team there, and we started going through the text together. And about halfway through, I realized that I was the head of the digital crimes unit, and I had not spoken at all, not at all during the meeting. And the reason is because it was not a digital crime treaty. It was a surveillance treaty. And I was like, this is not, this is a surveillance treaty clearly. And so you've just supported what 2.5 years ago, I was like, oh, okay, this is why we're engaging 2.5 years ago because of the, this really incredibly problematic text. One thing, we have been very engaged in this space. We've had some wins and other things that we have not. One of the biggest ones that you just mentioned is the ability to notify individuals if their data is being collected by any government around the world. This is a long-standing Microsoft position. So I started at Microsoft 10 years ago. One of the first cases that we litigated was the ability to notify our customers when the US government served us with legal demands. So it's not just any government, it's here in the United States as well that we have taken this position that transparency is incredibly important.
And that transparency can be like there are delayed notification procedures in the US when we were prosecutors, Eric and I. So it's not saying you have to do it to compromise an investigation, but you have to do it at some point to make
eventually
sure
people deserve to know that their data was used. Especially if data has been collected and you don't ever make it to court, right? And so you should know that that data was collected about you. There's no reason to keep non-disclosure in perpetuity, right? And so this is here in the treaty right now, there is no provision for notification at all. And if we were going to fight for that, in the US, where there are safeguards, it is a democracy, where there is a treaty where that may not be the case and it's being advanced by the Russian government, it becomes all the more important. Also, because there are no safeguards for human rights as well. And so this has become something that is going to be very challenging. You asked, do I think that there's anything that can mitigate it? I mean, I think the only thing that can mitigate it is clear language and text that allows for some type of notification by the country that received any compulsory legal demand. And then for any tech provider, to the extent that this does go forward, then the question will be one of what do you do when it comes to compliance? And we'll have to cross that bridge later.
because even if there is a provision, I could guess certain countries probably are not going to obey it, but we'll see. Yeah, so.
Well, that's and then it becomes the question of if they're not going to obey it, then do I obey the compulsory order? And I guess we'll get there sometime.
Which we'll look back in on another question. So, Katitza, civil society has been really remarkably aligned in this process, and during the negotiations. I think there have been several times when letters have been put out where, not just academia, but civil rights groups and industry have all aligned together, which is remarkable. I mean, if when you follow this in any other setting, that seldom happens. In fact, it's been very interesting to see that dynamic. What would you say, from your perspective, is really the most profound human rights issue that the convention creates right now? And remember, you only have 5 to 7 minutes.
I know. Okay, this is a challenge. We have been following the process since the start, and since day 0, we think that the treaty was unnecessary. We deem it unnecessary because it poses a serious risk to human rights across the world. And that was our concern. And after 7 sessions, we still have, the treaty still has significant flaws. And in fact, as you mentioned, Chris, all stakeholders, even those that we have never agreed on issues, with very diverse background, we are all opposing the treaty. This is because, as it stands, it's really a risk for cybersecurity. It makes enable unchecked broad data sharing and data collection practices without robust human rights safeguards in the treaty. And it defers to national law without putting those limitations in the text itself. And that's a problem for cross-border international powers. But we also see that even as of now, most of all these issues are still unresolved. Like member states have consistently struggled to find consensus on the scope of the treaty. Its scope, its human rights safeguards, it's even the basic definition of cybercrime. It is where attacks against computer systems, or crimes enabled by computer systems, or just anything by use of ICT, like my toaster. you know. So these are really things that are still persist today, and we can see that with the latest informal amendments, where even there are discussions about what's the title of the convention. So, but to your point, what are the most profound human rights issues? As always, I will say it depends. More from the beginning, you know, we have seen that a type of trade-off between the states about more content-related crimes and more surveillance. I think that is a false trade-off. It's not about more surveillance or more censorship. Both are kind of abuse of human rights abuses. So we think that it would be better not to trade in this currency at all. Human rights are not commodities to be traded, and they're universal. Everyone is born with the same, possess the same rights, on whether they live, their gender, their race, religious, cultural. So I think the criminalization chapter is still include broad content-related crimes that are disproportionate, and also criminalize the work of security researchers. And the broad scope of the international chapter also raised serious concerns because of this definition that Nick mentioned of serious crimes. As any offense punishable for an offense of 4 years or 4 or more years, this definition allows states to trigger these extensive surveillance powers without robust safeguards, deferring their protection to national law. And they do, and the problem is that there is no in the text, I would say, clear judicial authorization, no notification to users, no transparency obligations. They add right effective remedy, but how the user will exercise the right effective remedies will never know that their data have been requested in the first place. So is this, and even though the domestic surveillance chapter, like criminal procedural measures, also has problems, because it has certain safeguards, but they're still very weak. And as we see, many companies are storing data in other countries outside the US. So there are not safeguards that will limit the powers of the state to request data. It needs to be more stronger because of the parties that are involved in this treaty and the level of disparity of human rights protection. And it's even more problematic because it's not only about the text of the law. We are also talking about the judicial system and the independence to be able to comply with these safeguards. So in essence, I think that the convention fails. I think it's failing to protect against the abuses that it's trying to protect. And then also what is supposed to be an international effort to fight cybercrime, if I become a global surveillance pact. And this is very problematic. Not only because this is a misguided approach, not only because it facilitates cross-border repression, but also complicates the investigation of actual cybercrimes. We see all the time, ransomware, etc. So I think I could put more examples as we speak, but I think I will stop by. But I have concrete examples of these violations if you want at some point to talk about.
So the scope question is really critically important. And this was one of the concerns I think many US and many countries had in the beginning, because as you said, even the title of the convention is not clear. You know, the Russians like to say in the use of ICTs, which means really everything, including your toaster, basically. Whereas you know, the US and Europe and others have been said, no, it should be about cybercrimes. It should be attacks on systems, not every other thing where there are already laws for it. And the reason that becomes such a human rights issue is if you define the scope of some crimes as some countries would like to describe it, which is basically going after political dissent and other things, that right there is a clear human rights issue. I remember one of the interventions a couple times ago, the Chinese head of delegation was like, maybe we can criminalize people spreading rumors about natural disasters, which I thought was very funny. So it was like, so there is a subtext where they're trying to get at these things and rationalize. I mean, they can do it anyway domestically, and they're going to do whatever they're going to do domestically, but it gives it a sort of an international imprimatur if they can point to something and say that's a standard. So Jake, one of the issues in the convention, and you know, has drawn a lot of criticism, is how it, you know, what it may allow with respect to security research, which is done without the authorization of the system owner. and make it a criminal offense, or arguably make it. Now, there's been some language that's been put in, some hook that's been put in, but I think that's so it's better than it was, but still is an issue. What's your view on the importance of this significance of protecting good faith researchers in this area, who disclose vulnerabilities, who were able to do a lot to help cybersecurity and the whole cyber ecosystem?
Yeah, sure. That's a fantastic question. Wow, that's loud. Slide that down. That's a fantastic question, and there's really three big things that we see in the language there. The first being obviously the definition of without right. They also talk about unauthorized access, as well as, of course, it's really loud, as well as, of course, the potential for interference with systems. So, if I roll back, several years ago, right, we did most security testing. Most security testing happened on your machine, right? Because we had a lot of software running on our machines instead of in the cloud. I don't make a lot of tech predictions because they age like a fine milk, right? But one that I'm pretty confident in is that we're going to have more of our data in SaaS platforms tomorrow than we do today. And that's just a reality. And so, security researchers, basically now are up against these language barriers, right, or these very inarticulately put, pieces of language. Again, testing without right, doing things that involve unauthorized access. And system interference, for instance, again, is a very nebulous term. Does that mean that, again, as not defined, right? In the treaty, does that mean that we are possibly, spiking the CPU for a moment, right? Without any actual harm done? That's not clear. So, the reality is that as written today, practically all testing of SaaS-based platforms, right, that wasn't explicitly authorized by the vendor. So effectively any third-party testing or any bug bounty style testing or good faith security research to validate that a given platform is safe will be criminalized under the act, or excuse me, criminalized under the treaty, and that's hugely concerning. So.
And obviously this is not a new issue. This issue pre-exists in convention, but you can kind of understand where at least some states don't want to give a free pass. In other words, one of the common defenses when I prosecuted hackers was, oh, I was just testing the security, 1,000 times without telling anyone and then getting money. But there is a line you can draw. There's words do matter, and you could figure out something that prohibits that, by the same time allows the research to continue, right?
Definitely, right, and of course I've seen that as well, right, where folks are hammering this system and say, well, that's good faith research, right? But we can certainly put language together that again is going to allow for good faith research, and a safe harbor is really what I think is probably necessary. And so if we define what that safe harbor is, then it creates a very clear line between what is criminal and ultimately what is again, good faith security research without dealing with the intent. Again, the safe harbor, conditions, I think probably are the way to go there.
And this is where explanatory text, if there was, that would be very helpful, as it is in the Budapest Convention. Eric, you're gonna back clean up now, so I'll go to you. There's a provision in the convention that at least seemingly allows one state to ask another to seize individuals, such as traveling technology staff of a major firm, for instance. You work for a major firm, so this might hit you right in the pocket. Several of you do. Who have knowledge of the system's security, to force them to divulge access credentials to law enforcement without any prior request to the owner of the system or any notice after the fact, going to Amy's transparency point earlier. The question written is, how concerning do you think that is? But I don't even have to ask that part.
Very concerning.
Yeah. I think you can extrapolate on that a bit.
Yeah, no, I can respond to this neutrally because I don't have any of the access that would be demanded of somebody in this position. I'm a policy person, so and a recovering lawyer. I worked with Chris at the computer crime section at the Department of Justice. After there, I went to Microsoft. Maybe my next job is at EFF. We've got this lined up temporarily for me. And no, but I wanted to start off by saying thank you. And I think that thank you to Tech Accord for organizing this event. Thank you to Microsoft for your leadership and EFF for your leadership on taking on this important challenge. Amy, you mentioned the important work that Microsoft had undertaken to try to advance the transparency of information around compulsory requests or demands from the government. That's something that we joined in supporting from Cisco. And also, I had the opportunity when I was at Microsoft to work on the Reform Government Surveillance Coalition to try to advance transparency around the in response to the concerns around the application of the Patriot Act, which became the USA Freedom Act. I think it's important though for us to kind of zoom back for a second to think about why this conversation belongs here in the Tech Accord, and it really is well situated here because to me, the Tech Accord is really about the norms of behavior, both for governments. And so we advocate around the space, you know, the norms of behavior for cyberspace among governments, and then also reciprocal sets of things that companies can be pledging that, as John put so eloquently, improve the safety and security and democracy of this important shared space. And Chris has mentioned the importance of the Budapest Convention, which has been around for 20 some odd years now. I think frankly you could say that there's been not enough effort by the U.S. government in terms of promoting the adoption of it, and maybe that there's a silver lining here around this conversation has underscored the importance of an agreement that is anchored in these kinds of shared values. There are important elements of that even if there is a separate treaty, maybe the argument is that you need to have something that's anchored in the UN because the Council of Europe is a European document. Assuming that we need to have a treaty, I think that there are key elements that should be replicated in any agreement, and they are things like there's a 24/7 point of contact that is represented in the Budapest Convention, which enables countries to find who their counterparts are when they have emergency situations. It serves as a default MLAT where there is no mutual or bilateral legal assistance treaty that's in place. And then importantly, it allowed the U.S. government, because this is the way it was negotiated, and I'm sure Chris had a hand in this because he had a hand in almost every important milestone in cyber diplomacy in the history of the internet. But that it allowed the U.S. to not sign on to parts of it that would have required the prosecution of crimes that would violate the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And so I think you're hearing from all of us here, nobody's really kind of arguing that the opposing viewpoint that there are significant concerns that are raised by this treaty because they don't necessarily move in the direction of those kinds of agreed upon norms. And one of the areas that we would be concerned about, in addition to the scope of the crimes that would be covered and the potential demand assistance that might create human rights impacts through the transfer of information and technology that might be treated as dual use, is this idea that you could compel assistance from those in ways that would violate the due process expectations that we would see in liberal or Western democracies, depending on how you want to define that. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that we would be very concerned. I think all of us should be concerned about a text that would move us in that direction, because if the goal is security, then making sure that we have the ability to secure the systems and not have them be subject to the whims of governments who are deciding what crimes trigger that 4-year test that you're talking about would be of great concern. So I guess I'll leave it there.
Yeah, great. How much time? I know we started a little late, so how much time do we have for questions and answers? Okay, 10, 15 minutes. So now it's your chance to ask questions, make comments, whatever you like. So I'll open to the audience, both here and I guess online. Yes. Thanks. Mike is approaching.
Thank you. Elaine Korzak, research fellow at UC Berkeley. My question is, where do you see this conversation in 10 years? I think 10 years ago, another cybercrime treaty was not on people's minds. I think all eyes were on the first committee and the attempts or the proposals that Russia has made repeatedly in that committee. So, now we have treaty negotiations happening. Where do you see the space in 10 years from now? And where would you like to see it?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a long in the Russian playbook. I mean, they've wanted to have this treaty for a long time, and just you finally pulled the trigger on it a few years ago when the resolution happened. But it's an interesting question. Where do you see this going? I mean, let's say you can use either scenario. Nothing, they can't agree on a treaty, or they agree on a treaty. Where do you see this in a few years?
I'm gonna go with they can't agree on a treaty. And I actually think that in 10 years, we shouldn't be having this conversation with respect to UN treaties at all. What we should be doing is having solved the problem by making certain that countries are able to use an appropriate MLAT style process, right? Given the fact that most data is located inside the United States or controlled by a company that's inside the United States. The solution to the problem is not at the UN. The solution to the problem is in negotiated either Cloud Act agreements or mutual legal assistance improvements that have the appropriate safeguards in place. So I would say I'm hopeful that this spurs us to do a better job overall solving the issue, and we don't have to talk about it in 10 years.
Yeah. I would say, I totally agree with you. One thing that I would point out is that I think we all have sympathy for the idea that the governments that are trying to protect their citizens against crime and against terror, that there's information that they are dependent on getting from entities that are in the private sector. And oftentimes for most of these countries, that information is held someplace beyond their borders. And so there is a real challenge here that has to do with the ability to gain access to the information that's necessary to be able to stop bad things from happening, or to hold to account and to bring to justice those who are committing acts that warrant that. But we need to balance that in a way that allows us to achieve that important goal without undermining the important values, shared values that we have around due process and human rights. And so, so the answer is that whatever the mechanism that we come up with, that we should be aimed at trying to achieve a better balance for those goals. And so I'm not sure what you mentioned the line. Maybe there should be, we've talked a couple times about the odds of this happening. There should be an app where we could bet on this. But the goal that we're trying to solve for, I think, is one that we should start with a common understanding about that there is a real problem, that there is a challenge that we face, and that there is work that we need to do together in order to try to achieve that outcome.
I mean, there's really two parts of this convention. One is, having countries have the substantive crimes, because still many of them don't. So it's, the attacks on computer systems, et cetera. And then there's the evidentiary part. And, that's not new either. Countries have been talking about that. I mean, it's a fair point when, India or someone says, I have a citizen in my country who has done a crime against another citizen in my country, and I can't get the data to get them. And so that's, not an unfair point. There is the additional protocol and the Council of Europe Convention, so that might help to some extent.
Yeah, I hope we are not discussing anymore this topic. I think that the treaty is not solvable at all. Even with amendments, we can make it less problematic, but it's still very problematic. It's just the scope will not be fixed. And the scope is 4 years of serious crimes, any crime as defined by national law, meaning being LGBTQ plus sometimes is a serious crime. It's sometimes a death penalty. Being a photo of a kid of 16 years old with a tampon, it's also a serious crime in many countries, and it can be considered treason. So I think that the lack of disparity or harmonization of human rights safeguards is just too despair to be able to find some harmonized language. Although ideally it will be the UN, but as we see, there is no find of middle ground. The discussion on human rights is, this is not a human rights treaty, but we are talking about safeguards in criminal law. It's not like we won the ICCPR in the treaty. So I hope we are not. There's a need for access to data, and I hope MLATs get improved, since there is zero EFF have been asking to make the MLATs more expedited, more efficient, and that has failed. And I personally don't like the Cybercrime Treaty, but with Beckham mentioned, we have been criticizing since day zero, but it already exists, it's there, right? So states could potentially join and try to work on there is already mechanism for international cooperation that can be used. And why reinvent the wheel and keep discussing implementation for 10 years? It's already, there is a tool. I prefer to work on how to implement it in a way that is human rights perspective, use the flexibilities of the treaty to get safeguards, than keep trying to find consensus in a language that there is no middle ground to be achieved. So I hope I'm working on not the treaty and a type of implementation.
Okay.
I'll just say here that, look, security research, obviously very important, does not hold a candle to the issues with human rights that are obviously in this, so I want to put all this in perspective, right? For the piece that I'm talking about here. Yeah, I hope that, I hope this doesn't go forward, at least not as written. But that said, there does need to be some type of standardization of what safe harbor for security research looks like, because we live in a global society. I travel internationally, and I would like to not be detained crossing a border. That's a very real possibility. Germany has some very interesting cybercrime laws of its own, and I avoid Germany for a lot of reasons, right? Yeah. So again, I think we do need to standardize some level of safe harbor, because the reality is that security research makes everyone in the room, safer. I can tell you that I've personally discovered an ODay and a SaaS application that every one of us uses on a daily basis. I'm not going to call out the specific vendor, but that very serious vulnerability that under the terms of the provision the treaty as written today would be criminal. Not every SaaS vendor is located in the United States, right? Sometimes it's not even clear to me, where a particular piece of infrastructure is located, or where a piece of infrastructure might touch, or for that matter, how my data or how my traffic, may be routed into some third country. Even if I'm looking at coming from the US, say, to a infrastructure I believe is located in the UK, there may be a third country that it transits. Again, these are all very serious pieces that we have to address, right, for cybersecurity research to keep every one of us in the room safe. But that said, as the treaty goes, I hope we're not talking about this treaty in 10 years.
Yeah, I'd say on the positive side, and this was true before the treaty negotiations, whether the treaty comes in about or not, one of the key things really is going to be continued capacity building for countries, and legal capacity building, so they have the structures in place, whatever they are. If it's Budapest, if it's a new convention, if it's educating people on the human rights dimension of the convention that's passed, if that ends up happening, that's going to be critically important. And I think it's going to continue no matter what's going to happen. And that has to continue and be prioritized. One bright spot there is the counter ransomware initiative that now has 60 countries. I think they expanded even more, 63 countries. And there's a pillar of diplomacy and capacity building in it run by Germany and Nigeria. And my organization is now part of that too. And to help them with cybercrime. And so that's a long-term effort. So many countries are trying to do that. That's just going to be something that's going to be helpful.
So that capacity building effort is an important element of this conversation as well too. So that if there's a common understanding about what kinds of information are available and how you investigate and prosecute crimes, and also make sure that not only there's education but resources to be able to do those kinds of things, that helps to create an environment where we have a greater certainty about the common understanding about what kinds of things are criminal, making sure that their information is enabled to pass and flow to prosecute those kinds of crimes when we agree that common criminality. And so that has to be a part of the conversation as well too. And I'm glad to hear that GFC is working on that.
Other questions in the room? Don't be shy. Yes.
Hey, thanks. So imagining a world in which we get a positive outcome and a treaty that we think has appropriate human rights safeguards, protections for security researchers, is really properly fit for purpose. One of the leading concerns for a long time seems to be that there are cyber criminal groups that operate with some impunity or seeming impunity within foreign borders. Do we think a compulsory treaty or international instrument like this could be helpful in promoting countries operating with a bit more due diligence as it relates to those third actors?
So the safe haven problem, so the safe harbor problem. Go ahead.
Precisely.
I cannot foresee a treaty as you described, let's assume the perfect treaty. Even with the perfect treaty, your question basically goes to the heart of, do we believe that Russia will extradite cyber criminals to the United States or the UK or Germany for prosecution? No.
Others.
I think the problem is just not Russia and China. I'm talking about also Turkey, Philippines, and other countries with human rights atrocities. I know I shouldn't say that, but it's really serious, the disparity of human rights safeguards. So I'm a little worried about that. Part of the problem is the secrecy, because companies have been in a position to be able to challenge requests. I have done it in the US. But if all is happening without even civil society learn, we cannot push for more transparency, and we will be limited by the text, the language of the text. So I think this problem of harmonization of cybercrime is problematic because it creates this disparity of level of protection. And from a human rights perspective, that's problematic.
Or ransomware groups are foundationally organized crime, right? So even assuming a perfect treaty, right, that this basically, in my mind at least, is about the same as asking, assuming that we put better laws on the books, will the police being paid off by organized crime enforce the laws better? And my gut there is no, and my gut here as well is no.
And my experience has been no. That's
no.
Back when both when I was a prosecutor, so particularly that. I remember in the G8 context, when there was a G8 high-tech crime group, the Russian delegate put forth a proposal that the way the prosecution should work is that every other country should send all the information to the country where the criminal was, and that they would take care of it, which no one really took seriously. Other questions? Yep, back there.
Hi, Catherine. Oh gosh, this is quite loud. Catherine Goodyear, Microsoft. I work closely with John on communications. So this has been super helpful. Thank you. Just kind of hearing what you're saying, obviously there's a lot of bad that could happen. And I know July, August is kind of when the next round of negotiations, then the final round will happen. What needs to happen between now and then, and what audiences would you say that most need to be educated and brought on board so that we're not left with a catastrophic situation?
That those who is in countries, this battle is very hard, especially for civil society, because we have to advocate at the national level in several countries at the same time. And it's not only the diplomats, but are the people who are in capitals, in foreign affairs, the people who are making the round of consensus among nationals. The problem that I see, and by talking with some policymakers and foreign policy advisors, is that many don't even understand the implications of the treaty at all. It's very technical, and many are not even criminal lawyers or are not really understanding the complexity of a cross-border data request or what it entails. So it's complicated, but I think we need to pressure capitals, and we need to pressure help with civil society, companies, and in the media, op-eds, try to explain why is this problematic, and try to develop talking points that will resonate with developing countries. That's what we need.
And I would say there's been a number of sessions that EU has had, the US has had, where they talk to stakeholders and update them and get input from them over time. That I'm sure that a lot of the stakeholders don't think that's enough, but at least there's been that back and forth. So there's still opportunities to do that.
But I think we also need to make sure that we're focusing on a positive vision
Mhm.
that would give hope for there to be an alternate approach that would solve for some of the concerns that we talked about. If we provide mechanisms for capacity building, we show that there are mechanisms whereby countries that have legitimate concerns about investigating and prosecuting crime and terror have the ability to get the information that they need, then that's I think our only real hope to try to put attention in a different direction. Because if you just say, don't do this, but we don't offer anything else as a
Yeah.
substitute vision, then I think we're
And
unlikely
look,
to
I'd
make
say,
any
I
headway.
agree, Eric. I think, my perception is most people in that room are really acting in good faith, and they're cybercrime, officials, they're diplomats. They're not trying to do a gotcha. They see a need and they're trying to meet it.
And you can have sympathy for the concern that they're facing. I was in a meeting with the deputy chief of mission for India a number of years ago, and he said something like, "We're the largest democracy on the planet, and we can't get access to information that we need to protect our citizens." And so, that yes, there's always concerns about the definitions and the potential for these mechanisms to be abused. But if we don't provide any kind of vision for how the information can reach those who need it, then we're going to be we're going to be shunted away and told that our vision of just rejecting this is unrealistic.
I agree with that. I totally agree. And I think that's why we need to pressure the United States government, because they could make MLATs more expedited. It could make it more efficient. And if the United States doesn't sign the treaty, probably it will not be as useful as many others.
Other questions before we wrap up? We're kind of running down on
I
time.
just wanted to
Yeah.
foot stomp that idea, though, to making it more efficient, where if the U.S. government has a mechanism that it favors to try to make the sharing of information more expeditious and
Yeah, and
less
look,
complicated.
that was one of the points of the Cloud Act, because I was involved in that too, before I left government. And that was, that's a good initiative. The problem with that is that, when you have a country that doesn't have the same protections, procedural protections the U.S. has, one of the predicates is before they can do the Cloud Act agreement with them, they have to have that. And so some countries just don't want to change their laws, and so it's going to take a while. But yeah. Okay. Well, let's thank our panelists. Thank the Tech Accord for putting this on, and thank you for all for being here. We'll see where this goes. Next year, when you have the Tech Accord's 7th anniversary, we'll know what happened. The future will have happened. So I appreciate all you being here, and thank you again.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you all for coming. There is food and booze, I think, over to the left here or right, depending on which side of the stage you're on. Please join us.